What's up, Issa Hoops listeners, watchers? I'm Matt Issa, the guy who you often hear in those videos that I make. Here with my good friend Tyler Britton, the creator of Hoop Venue, the North Star of my YouTube channel, is here right now. We have a very special thing planned. But first, Tyler, how are you, man?
I'm doing great, man. I really appreciate you having me for this. I'm excited to talk about two really interesting players during a time that I feel like kind of gets overlooked. I feel like that transitional period in NBA history from the 2000s into the 2010s gets really overlooked as like a bridge era. So I think this is a fun little discussion we're gonna have.
Yeah, so this is the first installation, by the way, guys, of a new series, and I'm debating. I'm gonna ask you real quick, Tyler, actually, because you're the guy, right? You're the guy who understands how the world works. I was thinking, do I call this historical rumble, right? Where I just, we keep pitting these two forces against each other, or do I group that into another series I was thinking about starting up, which basically is focused on answering, big historical questions, like misconceptions, like, things of that nature. What do you think, Tyler?
I like the idea of looping it into something bigger because
Okay.
at a certain point, like the historical rumble thing is cool, but at a certain point you kind of hit a wall of like now I'm forcing it. Where it's
Mm-hmm.
like for today's discussion, we have two players who had similar play styles in the same era were actually compared. How many times has that actually happened to where the two players are comparable? You kind of hit a wall at a certain point. It's like
Yeah.
then what? And now you're kind of forcing discussions that weren't actually there. So I think looping it into something different where it's like you can also go NBA what ifs with it. You can go like what if these two teams like what if the '09 Lakers and Cavs matched in the finals? I think that would be cool too. Just like looping it into a whole big just answering questions about NBA history.
I love it. I love it. I was thinking about before you got on, I was working on my parents' garbage disposal and, just thinking about some NBA stuff. And I'm like, I wonder what players I could do this with. And first one that came to mind for some reason was like Michael Redd versus Ray Allen. And I'm like, okay,
Mm.
I love Michael Redd, but I don't think there's ever a point in time where anyone ever said to themselves, like, gee, man, like this guy is definitely better than Ray Allen right now. But so
Yeah.
you're right. You're right.
Yeah, it's like,
Anyways,
oh, who would I take in '07? Gilbert Arenas or Baron Davis? And it's like, well, how many people are actually asking these questions?
I'd probably take Gil. But so anyway, yeah, we mentioned 2 point guards. We're going to talk about 2 point guards today. Me and you are around the same age. I think I have you beat by 3-ish years, right? But I think we were both really getting into the NBA right around this time. And back in the day, Deron Williams was my favorite player, and I remember just being in lunchrooms, right, and just arguing Chris Paul, Deron Williams, Chris Paul, Deron Williams. It was like they were the two young point guards from I believe it's the 2005 NBA draft, if I'm not mistaken. Or I think
Yeah.
it's the 2005. Yeah, 2005 NBA draft. Drafted right by each other. Both like incredible college basketball players. Both, like you said, play very similarly. One of them, injuries, lack of desire to play basketball potentially played a factor in not taking care of himself. He tapered off. The other one just grew stronger, got better, and Chris Paul is one of the 20 great players we've ever been graced with watching. So this the question we're asking today, right, is not who had the higher peak or who's the better career, because I mean Clippers Chris Paul is better than both of these guys that we're going to talk about today, right? Would you agree, disagree?
I think you could talk me into the New Orleans CP3 versus Clippers CP3 debate, but if I were like forced to pick a year of Chris Paul, it'd be 2015.
Okay,
That to
so
me
yeah,
is like when everything kind of cultivated
yeah,
or
so
culminated.
so and basically, like, no one's gonna say that there's a Deron Williams season that's better than the 2015 Clippers season, right? Or at least that, like, maybe let's not spoil anything, right? But that's not the point of this question. What we're asking ourselves right now, when that era, we're going back to that time period, right after Deron Williams, helps push the Utah Jazz to an improbable Western Conference Finals run, playing the San Antonio Spurs. They get swiftly discarded, although a lot of people probably wouldn't have been swiftly discarded by the San Antonio Spurs. And so you get that era. It's like from 2007 to 2010, and these two are just going neck and neck. 2010 after 2010, all these comparisons, right? And so that's what we're focusing on right now. Was Deron Williams, the big question here is, was Deron Williams actually better than Chris Paul at that time, or was it always just kind of like Chris Paul was that guy? Now, we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. Let's start. I think the best way to do these kind of discussions, in my opinion, right, is to separate defense and offense. And, we'll see who the better defender is, how much of a gap there is there. Obviously, with guards, it's not as important to be a great defender. And then we'll look at the offense, which I think is a much more sophisticated discussion, right? And then we'll kind of talk about some impact metrics, playoffs, all that good stuff, and we'll come to some sort of conclusion, right? Let's start with the defense real quick because I feel like that's a pretty simple conversation to have, right? Would you, Tyler, okay, tell me if I'm off base here. Probably Chris Paul is the better defender between these two, and it's
very comfortably. Yeah, I actually had that written in my notes. I was like, let's start with defense because we can knock this out of the way. I don't think Chris Paul was the defender he would one day become. I actually think that's the big separator between New Orleans CP3 and Clippers CP3 is he did become a much better defensive player. But he still made the all-defensive team in 08 and 09, still led the league in steals both years. He's not as strong as he would one day become, so maybe you don't get the ability to switch up onto wings like a Kevin Durant, for example, in the playoffs. Also, I think he got smarter. Like he ends up becoming one of the smartest defensive players ever. Masterfully using his smaller frame to make plays. But he's still just this monster defensive playmaker who's going to be flying all over the court, causing turnovers, getting around screens, picking up guards with pressure and things like that. So I do still think you get this positive defender, even if it isn't just this clear all defensive caliber guy. Whereas Williams, I don't think was some team-altering liability, awful defender, but lower motor, less playmaking, not really viable at the point of attack, not super switchable, just kind of out there, I feel like. So I do think there's a pretty big difference between this strong positive defender and then someone who I'd say like probably a comfortable minus, but not some big liability. How much of that, like how much of a difference is it though? Is really the question. And I think based on like some of the impact metrics I was looking at, like Darko's defensive plus minus, RAPM over the 4-year stretch, that type of stuff, all kind of points to maybe Chris Paul's worth like 0.7, 0.8 points per 100 possessions more on defense. And I do think that's really important. So if we're talking about half a point per game, keep that in the back of your mind. We're going into this offensive discussion. Chris Paul has an immediate half-point advantage at least.
Yeah, I think the big misconception I had, I've watched a lot of both of these players, old games from this time, but it was never really with the focus on being on them. Like it was, I'd watched a lot of Manu Ginobili a couple of years ago, so I got to see the Chris Paul Spurs series. Watched a lot of Andre Kirilenko a few years ago, so naturally Deron Williams was around, right? But I'd never really focused in on the two of them, and I just remember thinking to myself, like, yeah, man, like Hornets Paul was this all-league defender, and he really, like you said, at the point of attack, he doesn't really navigate screens super well. He's not like they would switch him a lot, right? They would do a lot of switching for some reason, and he wouldn't really hold up well on those switches. But again, just incredible defensive playmaker, nail defender at that time, despite the wingspan. The one thing I will say, like, I remember before I started doing research for this video, what sparked my interest in doing it was, another North Star of this channel, right, is the Thinking Basketball podcast. Has been doing their greatest peaks of the 2000s, and they kind of talked about Deron Williams' honorable mention, and the way they spoke about their defense, all due respect, like they made it sound like this guy's like Trae Young or Damian Lillard, and to me, I didn't see that. Like I thought, like especially for that era with the lack of spacing, like there was this one 2010 game I watched against the Portland Trailblazers where, and I know it's just one game, but this guy was like locking up Brandon Roy. Right, and it's just like I'm like, okay, so he could use his strength, right? He could leverage that. He's a super, super strong guy. So yeah, I would say he's definitely a negative, but he's not like the ultra detrimental. Like, I need 4 Jalen Johnsons on the court to protect this guy. And
it's worth noting too that the 2010 Jazz were a notably better defensive team than the previous years, and that's the one year where his metrics kind of like look like he's a neutral-ish defender. So maybe
they play more of a realistic like center because Okor is missing a lot of time and he's not exactly a
right
high end defensive center at a position that really matters. And yeah, that's pretty much. They get a lot more
and also
defenders with Wes Matthews and CJ Miles, etc.
The era too, like guards couldn't really be as detrimental to a defense back then because there wasn't as much mismatch hunting. teams weren't making them defend as the low man and stuff. You could kind of
Mhm.
hide those guys, and sure, they're going to get brought into some action, but it's not like today where you get to the Pacers Knicks series and it's we see Jalen Brunson and Cat, and we are putting both of you in every single action. That just wasn't the way the game was played back then.
Exactly. I mean, and the spacing was so. I was watching a Nuggets Hornets game a couple days ago, and Chauncey Billups was driving to the lane, and he got past Paul, but he couldn't score because Chris Anderson is posting up in the same side as him, and I'm like,
Yeah,
excuse me, like it's just like what? It's just
that's real
I don't
hoops,
know.
man. That's real hoops.
That's ethical hoops. Anyway, okay, so we'll put a pin in that, right? Offensively, do you want to start talking about Chris Paul's offense or Deron Williams' offense? What are you thinking?
I think we should start with DWill because I feel like
Okay.
everyone kind of gets the gist with Chris Paul, but DWill is kind of like more, if you know, you know. Um,
Yeah. Well, first of all, this guy, blinding quickness,
yeah,
right? He's so fast. Incredible handle, right? And the thing I love about his handle is like he can go from move to move like consecutively on a string, right? He can go tween and then go behind the back and then go front crossover, like just combines moves. Like it's like he's playing Mortal Kombat, right? The way he's like able to put together these combinations and stuff. Very strong, very good passer, right? Very, very good passer. Like I watched like him play some high level defense of that era, like the Celtics, when they had KG. Obviously, the Spurs always were like a very venerable defense. Um, the Lakers of that time, and like it's just like this guy had an answer for every coverage to me. You know, like his size helps him a lot. He's taller guard at that time, 6'4", so he's able to see a little bit better over hedges. Very, very quick reaction speed in terms of playing as a connector at times, right? And again, I think we will have to talk a little bit about the Jerry Sloan of this all and how much that helped him. But you know, he was incredible in the pick and roll, could score at all three levels. Like most players in this era, it's just something that's funny to me because like I feel like this era talks a lot about how the new era is like not like you know how like they always say like, oh, like defense is simple, you just got to play as weak hand, right? And it's like in this era we're talking about with Deron Williams, Chris Paul, like most players couldn't finish with both hands. Like honestly, like I like watched Deron Williams and like I would say like 19 out of 20 times, this guy's an incredible rim finisher, right? But 19 out of 20 times he's going to the rim, he's finishing with that right hand, no matter which way he's driving. And I just think it's funny. It's like nowadays, like the old heads are like, oh, defense is simple, you got to play their weak hand. Well, now everybody has like no weak hand, so you know what I mean? But yeah, I think that's. What do you want to say about Deron Williams, real quick? I got a little caught up, but yeah.
no, no worries. I think DWill is really interesting because both of these guys are like heavy usage pick
Mm-hmm.
and roll ball
Mm-hmm.
handlers, but it's a very different approach. Chris
Yes,
Paul's
yes,
like
yes.
I'm gonna use my quickness, my low center of gravity, and my pace to kind of just get where I want to go on the floor methodically. Whereas Dan's like, I'm bigger than you, I'm lengthier than you, I'm more athletic than you. I'm gonna turn this corner, and there's nothing the big can do to prevent me from getting where I want to go. Both have strong mid range games.
Mm-hmm.
Both are top tier passers. Like these are two of the five best passers on the planet at the time. I think Deron Williams in particular was just so good at generating that downhill pressure with the size, with the athleticism, with the touch to finish in a variety of ways. And I think that really stood out in the playoffs. Like Deron Williams has a massive scoring imprint in the playoffs. During those 4 years in the regular season, 18 points a game plus 3% relative true shooting. In the playoffs, 21 points per game plus 5% relative true shooting. So you get this big increase in scoring volume and efficiency over a 44 game sample. And Utah's offense got better. They were a +5 relative offensive rating in the playoffs. Just an elite playoff offense. And I think you get these signals where it's like Deron Williams, you kind of talked about it. He has an answer for every coverage,
Mm-hmm.
but also just not being able to scheme for his athleticism at the position. He gets to the line a lot more in the playoffs, gets to the rim even more. And I think if you wanted to point to one big difference between Chris Paul and Deron Williams in their approach, in the way they run the offense, I think it's the fact that there was a lot less switching back then, and we've seen in recent years, going from the Clippers to the Thunder, Rockets, Phoenix. Chris Paul is a masterful isolation creator when he has a mismatch. It's like if you switch the pick and roll, I'm going to back it up and I'm going to torch this big in space. But back then, teams weren't switching as much. It was a lot more hedging, a lot more dropping. And so Chris Paul doesn't really get as many mismatches, so you don't really get this isolation scoring imprint. He only averages 2 points per game in isolation over the entire stretch.
Mm.
Whereas Deron Williams can legitimately break down his primary defender one on one. And I think that's something that gets significantly more valuable in the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, just one series that really stood out to me in 2007, right? That Spurs series where like I remember it, as just like the Utah Jazz were just completely outclassed by the Spurs team. Deron Williams is young. He's kind of like what Tyrese Halliburton was when the Pacers first went to the Eastern Conference Finals, right? Like similar analogy. And you look back at the numbers though, this guy was probably the best player in the series, right? 26 points, 8 assists. 61% true shooting back then. It was like, what was the league average? Like 53% at the time. So
Yeah,
it's just
something like that.
it's just bonkers. Like, and it goes back to like you said, like that burst. He has that bullet, that silver bullet, right? That silver bullet skill that you just can't. There is no scheme for it because of his athleticism, and it led to his downfall. Right when he lost that, he didn't have the craft that Paul was able to fall back on with age and stuff. I want to say something about the passing, right? Where it's like it's very similar, right? The passing is very, very, very similar. But I want to say at this time, I would give a slight edge to Deron Williams because of the ability to, use his size and see over defenders. I thought length bothered Paul a lot at this time. And it could take away some of his sight lines. And I think also the other thing is I think Deron Williams is a little bit better. Both these guys are high usage guys, but I think Deron Williams is a little bit better as an off ball passer. I'm remembering a possession off the top of my head where, Deron Williams, multiple possessions where Deron Williams just catches the ball, immediately knows where to go with it next. Whereas, like, there's a couple times Paul catches the ball and then it's like he has to take a dribble and then he makes the pass. And I know it's something so small, but like when you're talking about two guys who play very similarly, who put up these gaudy numbers, like you need to find ways to discern them. And that was just something to me. What did you think about their passing?
I do want to circle back to that off ball discussion because I think it's really interesting. But just with
Yes.
the passing, I do feel Chris Paul has a pretty clear advantage just in terms of the ability to hit the tightest windows in the court. Like, I think that's one of the things Chris Paul has always been a master of. Not that DWill couldn't, it's just that Chris Paul's on a short list of there's no way this pass is going to get where it needs to go. And it's just threads the needle perfectly. Like, whether it's to Tyson Chandler or David West on a roll, whether it's a shovel pass or a lob. I do think Chris Paul just wins the like pure passer in terms of accuracy, not turning the ball over, that sort of thing. Even if Deron Williams maybe was a slightly more versatile passer at the time, I think you can make that argument because of the size and, like you said, the off-ball passing. But I did want to specifically highlight the off-ball game in general because I do think that's a very clear advantage for Deron Williams, not
Yes.
just with the passing, but the ability to slash off the catch. Even like this version of Chris Paul wasn't really shooting threes. So you don't get as much spacing from Chris Paul as you would when he's on the Clippers. I think this is kind of, I'm assuming this is where you were going with like the Jerry Sloan side of things. Utah ran a
Yes.
lot of off ball screens. Like that was their
Flex
offense,
action.
especially in 2010. Per synergy, they scored like 8.5. I think it was 8.5 possessions a game off of off ball screens where they tried to score. And second in the league was like 7. Like they're running so many more off ball screens than any other team in the league. And I wanted to ask you actually, do you think that's archaic or ahead of its time? Because this was like in the 90s, that was the offense, but it also feels like that's the offense now. So like, were they ahead of their time or were they behind?
Well, I mean, I coach high school basketball, and we use like a lot of his flex concepts. I clipped a handful of plays and I sent it to my head coach, and I'm like, love this ATO, love this sideline out of bounds play. So I mean, I think like the idea, the way they were doing it back then, right? Like where it's like they were running flexes and not worrying about, and like they would like curl off the flex to take a mid-range shot, like that was archaic, yeah. But like the general idea of like these, think about the Denver Nuggets, right? These rip screens that they'll set, like they'll have Jamal Murray screening for Jokic or Jamal screening for Aaron Gordon. Like you don't want to switch that, and it's the same concept with like Deron Williams, right? It's like you don't want to switch, you don't want to switch the guy who's defending Carlos Boozer onto Deron Williams and vice versa, right? So that was one part of the. I was like, I don't want to be super quick to give Deron Williams the edge off ball because, again, he's playing an offense. And we learn later on, right, that Deron Williams wasn't exactly excited about playing in such a regimented offense, and him and Jerry Sloan weren't the best of friends. But So that was kind of something I had to factor in. We have to factor in general when we talk about them as offensive players. But even then, like if you look at it, like I think during that time period that we're talking about, Chris Paul, like 15% of his buckets are assisted, whereas Deron Williams is like 40%. And like 40% is not great, like, as an off ball player, but it's like it's night and day what Chris Paul was doing. And I think it goes back to a lot of what you said with the athleticism. And I think his shot release was just quicker, even though he didn't take a whole bunch of more threes than Chris Paul did.
I actually went into Synergy and calculated the off-ball points per game for each of these guys. So these are plays that are spot ups, off-screen, screener, like, just typical off-ball possessions. Over the 4-year span, Deron Williams averages 6.6 points per game, and Chris Paul averages 3.3. So you're talking doubling Chris Paul's off-ball scoring production. That's without even getting to the off-ball playmaking or all of the plays where Deron Williams' movement just creates gravity. I also think Deron Williams pretty underrated cutter. Even if he didn't always cut, it's like if the action was top locked or if he drew two, he could cut back door and he had the size and athleticism to finish out of those plays. So I do think, and that's not to say, like, I do think some of that is the offensive talent and the coaching. New Orleans didn't have the facilities to run that type of offense, but I also think it's worth noting we've never seen that from Chris Paul. We didn't see it with the Clippers much. We didn't see it in Houston. We didn't see it in Phoenix. Chris Paul is the type of guy, like, your offense is going to be structured around his ability to run spread pick and roll, and that's going to be what it is. I do think you get like a more methodical, slower game with Chris Paul, whereas with Deron Williams, it's catch and go, catch and go. And I do think that is worth noting as an advantage in the favor of Williams.
Yeah, and another thing I want to talk about with like that, we talk about the downhill pressure, the burst. I want to know if you feel this way, because if you look at the numbers, like the rim numbers aren't like strikingly different, right? Paul's a little bit better of a finisher. Deron Williams gets there a little bit more often. Free throw rates are pretty similar, but I thought like, so again, another one of the things you hear a lot, like if you go on Twitter right now, you could see like that highlight of Chris Paul dunking in, being like, young Chris Paul was like an athletic freak, blah, blah, blah. And like, I was kind of unimpressed. Like he would get into the deep paint a lot, but he would kind of get those like De'Aaron Fox, Brunson finishes, you know what I'm talking about, where it's like this super short floater. He's not like actually getting all the way to the rim, putting the ball off the glass and scoring. And I think that's like a noticeable difference between like Deron Williams, who's like getting all the way to the rim. Like all he needs to do is put it on like the glass, in the right part of the glass, and he has scored. Like I think that's a big difference. And it, like, there's levels to rim pressure, right? It's not just about I get you 7 rim attempts per 75 possessions. It's about like how good are these rim attempts? Are you actually just taking like a really short floater? Did you see that at all, or do you think that that's pretty much a wash at rim pressure?
No, and I know exactly what you're talking about too. It's like those awkward kind of like running. He's kind of like falling out of bounds.
Jalen Brunson, kind of.
Yeah, it looks like he's like falling out of bounds, but he can get away with it because of the touch. Like Chris Paul just has this freak touch. He can make every type of shot in the book. But I do think that goes back to the playoff discussion, where with Chris Paul we can't really go off playoff numbers because it's a 12-game run in 08 and a 5-game run in 09, and that's it for this stretch.
And the Nuggets series was just treacherous. I watched
an awful series.
It's sad basketball, man.
It is, and it's like we can't really work off of what Chris Paul actually did in the playoff, and then the 08 run, like Chris Paul at his best, really offensively. But I do think if we saw the bigger playoff sample from Chris Paul, we would have seen a bigger disparity in those rim numbers in the playoffs than we do in the regular season because, like you said, Deron Williams gets all the way to the rim more. And I do think he had a more versatile finishing package when it came to like dealing with length and shot blockers around the rim. I think we could. Do you want to talk about Chris Paul's offense then, since you kind of already went into it a little bit with the finishing?
Yeah, I think I want to start with like, okay, if I had to use one word like to describe Deron Williams, it'd be like forceful, right? It's very like he just goes at people. With Chris Paul, the first word that comes to mind is like he was slippery, right? I saw a lot of splitting the pick and roll. Like he wasn't his handle. I would just put it straight. I think Deron Williams had a better handle than Chris Paul at this time. Just like the crossover and being able, like I said, to put all those moves on a string. Like whereas Paul was kind of like weaving his way around the defense, saw a lot of slips, a lot of putting defenders on his back, a lot of those like short floaters. Not so much like I'm just gonna drive right around this hedge, So I would say that's an important part. He had like it makes me laugh, right? It makes me smile because he had all those old man tricks back then. Like he was more athletic, right? But he did all of the like little, I'm gonna get a foul in the backcourt, or I'm gonna, push my ass out and like try to draw a foul that way, or just all that stuff. Obviously, like you said, very, 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 very good passer, incredible turnover suppressor. The regular season numbers are just insane. Like, he was a better scorer than Deron Williams in the regular season, had more assists. I think one thing that we need to factor in Deron Williams' favor, though, is that his offensive load is just much higher. He was playing just like it's basically like Jalen Brunson. Like, that's what Byron Scott was doing. Sorry about my dog, by the way, but that's what Byron Scott was doing. Where it's like his offensive load, I believe at the time was like 55% Chris Paul, whereas Deron Williams is like 45%. And it's basically like what you see with Brunson now. It's like either Chris Paul is bringing the ball up, starting the action, everything's gonna flow through him, heliocentrism, or like they do like the half-ass off-ball shit where it's like, okay, let's run Chris Paul off this floppy screen. He's not going to shoot off of it. He's going to catch it, and then he's going to go and run into his offense. And I always wonder, like, does that really give the defense a different look? Like, are you really doing anything? But I regress.
I guess maybe I will say maybe it's like an energy thing. Like the defender's going to be a little bit more gassed having to chase the guy around an off-ball screen first.
Yeah.
But I've always found that funny when and not to go off track here, but there was a lot of I remember I would have debates with people about Allen Iverson's off-ball value, and they'd be like, do you see how many screens he's running off of? And I'm like, well, he's running to go get the ball, and then ISO. So is that really off-ball value? Is that, it's the same thing with Chris Paul. I do think this version, so the reason I said earlier that you can talk me into the Hornets Chris Paul being his peak is because of two things. One, I think you kind of touched on it, the added agility. Like, this guy's a blur with the quickness. And he just simply got into the paint a lot more than he did in the later years. He just gets all the way, not all the way to the rim, but just 2 feet in the paint pretty consistently when he needs to, in an era with not too much spacing. You get like a David West pick and pop to the midi. We'll count that as spacing. But I do think Chris Paul, this version of Chris Paul gets 2 feet in the paint a lot more consistently, and I think that allowed him to have a more prolific game as an on-ball creator, which is why you get almost 12 assists a game and 22 points a game instead of 19 and 10. The other thing, though, is, and I think this is actually where Chris Paul historically is so underrated, is this version of Chris Paul was really good in transition. Really good in transition.
Yes.
Whereas I think nowadays you get used to Chris Paul wants to slow down, walk the ball up court, let's get our offense set up and run pick and roll. Whereas this version of Chris Paul was shot out of a cannon. And I think that is actually a big advantage he had over even Deron Williams, who was also a very good transition guard. I pulled the numbers for, again, those 4 years. Deron Williams, this is transition possessions that either ended in a shot attempt or an assist. You get 4.7 possessions from Deron Williams. You get 5.5 from Chris Paul, so about an extra possession in transition, which does go a long way for offensive rating. Transition plays are very efficient. To that credit, Deron Williams in transition, those plays generated 1.4 points per possession, and for Chris Paul, you get 1.55 points per possession. So with Chris Paul, you get almost I won't say quite Steve Nash-esque, because that's just on another level, but you get this elite transition force for 5 or 6 possessions a game that really boosts an offense, especially when we're talking about a less talented offensive group in New Orleans for most of those years outside of 2008. So I do think with Chris Paul, you don't get as much rim pressure as Deron Williams, but you do still get some semblance of it. You get, obviously, just this surgical mid-range game. You get the elite passing. I think the turnovers are an important note here. Just because
turnover suppressors. Both of them
They both are for sure. But Chris Paul is like Tyrese Halliburton. Where it's 2 turnovers after touching the ball 100 times. And I think that's a credit to both the passing and the handle. Of course, there's the risk adversity thing where it's Chris Paul is maybe not taking as many risks as someone like Steve Nash. But still, if a guy's going to handle the ball 100 times, run 50 pick and rolls, and turn it over twice, your offense is going to be in a pretty good spot regardless of what the actual shot making looks like. So yeah, who did you come away? So let me ask you this question. If you were to start an offense from scratch and structure it around one of these guys for the 4 years, who would you rather have as your engine?
Can we punt that for a second? Because there's one more part of offense I feel like we haven't really gotten to yet, and I think it just needs to be talked about really quickly.
Gotcha.
I wanted to make one little note. I think both of them did have that like Tyrese Halliburton in terms of like we're gonna push off the make. I was very impressed. I think multiple times a game I would see both of them kind of just be like, okay, they made a shot. I'm running down the court. We're gonna get a good shot on that end. Just wanted to say that. But who did you think was a better shooter?
I I don't know. Because they both took like two or three threes a game. Deron Williams, you get this like weird up and down percentage with like 39% one year, 32% the next year. Also Deron Williams, really good mid-range shooter too. What do the free throw numbers look like? I actually didn't look at the free throw numbers. I think
Deron Williams like in like the low 80s, and Chris Paul. Let's look. I was looking at Deron Williams because I was trying to figure that out too. I feel like I'm just gonna spoiler. I'm gonna say it's Chris Paul just because he's always a better mid-range shooter than Deron Williams. So
I would
his
assume
free throw
Chris Paul
percentage is in the high 80s. So yeah, I would say Chris Paul by a hair. I think they're both very good, not great shooters.
Well, I pulled there's another number I pulled. I agree, and there's another number I pulled from Synergy because we don't have pull-up threes before 2016 I think it is. So I went and looked at threes that were either in the pick and roll or isolation, and I was like, let's call this an on-ball three. And Deron Williams attempts 1.3 on-ball threes a game. Chris Paul attempts 1.2. So, again, we're talking about guys who just really aren't looking for the pull-up three because the era was a lot different. But Deron Williams made 36% of those, and Chris Paul made 31%. So maybe there's an advantage there. I mean, again, it's a tiny sample. You get, like, over the 4 years, what you get. I mean, 200-something shots, probably, 200 or 300 shots. So maybe there is an advantage there. I did think that was interesting because I do feel like there were situations in the playoffs where Deron Williams would start to see like an under, and he's like, wait, I can make this pull-up three. I can lean on this for some playoff scoring. You do get those moments. Whereas with Chris Paul, I don't think ever really had those stretches of, I'm going to burn you with the pull-up three. I mean, again, you go to Houston, and it's like the game against Utah where this guy can rattle off 8 threes, and it's like, okay. I mean, Chris Paul goes on to become one of the greatest shooters ever, I think. But this version of Chris Paul really only inside the arc with that.
But his mid-range, like, that's the thing. We have such a larger sample with their mid-range shooting, and, like, Deron Williams is always, like, mid-40s. Chris Paul's, like, in the high 40s. I would
lean Chris Paul. If I had to pick one, I would lean Chris Paul.
Okay. Yeah, they're both very, very good mid-range shooters, very good three-point shooters. But before so I feel like, who would you rather have as your offensive engine? That kind of answers who's the better offensive player, right? Because that's, like, what their archetype is, right?
So I actually had this in my notes. I was like, at first I felt that way, but then I was like, okay, I do agree that like these guys are both offensive engines, but I also look at Deron Williams' off-ball game, and I'm like, okay, think about that era. What if you already have a Kobe Bryant, or you have a LeBron James, or you have a Dirk? Who would you rather have like as your next guy, like your second scorer? I think that's really interesting because Deron Williams gives you a little bit more of a dynamic approach, whereas, like I said, with Chris Paul, it's this rigid pick and roll type of thing. So maybe I'll spoil it for me. I did come away. I do prefer Chris Paul as the engine of my offense. If I have to have one of these guys as an on-ball guy, I think slightly more versatile half-court shot creator, which I think is more so with the mid-range game that you kind of just talked about. Probably a better difficult shot maker. Like I said, I do prefer him as a passer, but you could take Deron Williams. I wouldn't be mad at that. And then I do think he's slightly better at pushing pace. But then I was like I said, if you already have that leading scorer, that megastar running the offense, and not to say these guys can't compete with those guys in terms of offensive value. Like you could say Chris Paul or Deron Williams is one of the 5 most valuable offensive players in the league at this time. They're not going to be if you have a Dirk, your offense is going to be built around Dirk. Or if you have a Kobe or if you have a LeBron. Like think about the triangle offense, for example. If you were to plug one of those guys into the triangle, would Deron Williams not be the more valuable offensive player in that ecosystem?
Of course, no. So, yes. But I still think you, like, at this time, like, okay, look, I want to just point this out real quickly. During that 4-year stretch, who do the Utah Jazz lose to? The San Antonio Spurs. They win the NBA Finals in 2007. In 2008, they lose to the Los Angeles Lakers, right? Los Angeles Lakers go to the NBA Finals, come within 2 games of winning it. 2009, they lose to the Los Angeles Lakers, win the NBA Finals. 2010, they lose to the Los Angeles Lakers, lose the NBA Final, win the NBA Final. I mean, the Utah Jazz could have won an NBA title during that stretch. If they didn't have to keep running into the Lakers. They were very good. They were very good. They were a very, very good basketball team. And so, for me, like, I think both these guys would be a number one on a championship team. Like, I think every season, right, you could say there's probably, what would you say, 6 or 7 guys in the NBA who could be the best offensive player on a championship team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say during that time they both were. So, I don't know, like, there's not, like, I feel like, okay, yes, I agree with you. Deron Williams is definitely the...
Let me rephrase that then, because I think I agree with you. Like especially those Utah offenses, they had a +4 relative offensive rating over the 4 years. They were, I think, if the Phoenix Suns didn't exist, the Utah would have been remembered as the best offensive team.
Yeah, they were the gold standard.
Like second half of the decade. But let me rephrase it like this, because I think you would agree with me that both Chris Paul and Deron Williams would have been the best offensive player on the Nuggets. But I still think if you're the Denver Nuggets and you have Carmelo Anthony, the isolation game is going to be like half of your offense.
Yes.
And so it's like maybe Deron Williams or Chris Paul is your best offensive player, but when you're running through Melo, I do think I just think there's inherent value with Deron Williams being able to maybe shift between roles more than Chris Paul.
Play the on-ball, off-ball hybrid.
But like Kyrie and LeBron, like the LeBron. I mean, there's been recent Kyrie versus Chris Paul debates, which I think is a little bit crazy, but the argument stems from look at what Kyrie was able to do playing off of LeBron. And there is a lot of value in that when we're talking about, because at the end of the day, you're in agreement with me here. We're trying to decide which of these guys is more valuable on a championship team. And it's like, while they both can be number ones, there are still a lot of situations where they would have to mend with high-end talent, like an on-ball. And this is an era where isolation scoring is king. Every team wants their isolation creator running the offense. So I do think that poses an interesting question, in my opinion, of who would I rather have on the best possible championship offense?
Yeah. Okay, so back to what you're saying. Like, I agree with that, yes. But, like, how many teams... Like, okay, you have to balance, like, obviously you want to win a championship team, right? But it's also, like, you have to be realistic. Like, what's the supply and demand of the league? And, like, how many Carmelos do you get, like, that are, like, even, okay, so basically that's what they did, right, with Chauncey. Chauncey Billups was a better offensive player than Carmelo Anthony in 2010. Spoiler alert to anyone who didn't know that. But, like, they didn't have a team that could win the championship, you know? Like, they couldn't get it done. Like, so, like, how many guys, like, they needed, like, a slightly better version of Carmelo Anthony, right? So, Carmelo
Do you think, I mean, they also, I mean, in 2009, they also lose to the Lakers.
Okay, you're right.
And to be fair, I mean, how much of this is the Hornets series, but they had, like, their playoff numbers were crazy. They were a crazy good team, and I actually think it's more so the defense. Like, I think the offense was blistering hot. Like, with Billups and Melo doing that little two-man punch. And it was much more successful than what you saw with Allen Iverson and Melo. And I think some of that is Billups being just a much superior off-ball player.
Okay.
And like,
by the way, you talked about did I make my joke when you said, you know, guys didn't really take pull-up threes back then? Chauncey Billups took a lot of pull-up threes.
Chauncey Billups did take a lot of pull-up threes. But like, okay, let's look at 2008, for example. I think 2008 is where you get arguably, I personally think Deron Williams' best year of the stretch is 2010, but I think 08 is right there, and I think 08 is right there for Chris Paul's best. It's either 08 or 09. So I do think 08 is the best intersect of peak Deron Williams and peak Chris Paul during this stretch. And if you look at the teams that were like competing for a championship in 08, let's think like, who would you rather have as the point guard? So if you're replacing Rondo on the Celtics, I think you would rather have Chris Paul there pretty easily. I think in that defensive ecosystem,
yes.
And then as the engine of the offense with Ray Allen and Paul Pierce playing off ball.
Yeah.
Detroit was the other team with the second highest net rating. I think that's really interesting because that offense kind of really could have used the high end slashing from Deron Williams.
Yeah, I mean, he's like, Deron Williams is like juiced up Chauncey Billups, like, because he can, you know, do all the pull up stuff, and then he's got the rim pressure that Billups didn't really have. So yeah, I think I would prefer Deron Williams on that team. Okay, let's keep going.
And then you get like the Lakers. I think Lakers, Deron Williams. I think with the triangle offense with Kobe as your go-to guy, I'd rather have Deron Williams. This is just speaking on offense, of course. Jazz, we already saw it with Deron Williams. They had a +7.5 net rating. That's just nasty. Yeah. And the Magic, I think I'd rather have Chris Paul running two-man game with Dwight. But Spurs, where I'm going with this essentially isn't to say one of these guys is inherently more valuable offensively because XYZ. It's just it is very team dependent, I think. I think
Mm-hmm.
based on what you already have, what system you have in place, they have a similar play style but do bring different skills to the table.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to talk about the analytical part of all this, right? We've cited some numbers, but Chris Paul has always been a darling, right, of the plus minus data, and this is where I'm kind of like confused because just like from watching film, looking at playoff numbers, all that stuff, and I know I never answered your question fully. I would say that I prefer Deron Williams as an offensive engine and as an off-ball player. Just from eye tests, seeing the burst, seeing the versatility of his passing, seeing the off-ball, on-ball juice, seeing how his playoff numbers he gets stronger in the playoffs. He reminds me kind of like Anthony Edwards, right? Whereas Chris Paul, like I could see some vulnerabilities being poked at during that time. So that's what I was leaning. But then you look at the impact metrics. Like look at EPM, right? Offensive EPM during that stretch. In 2008, Deron Williams a plus 3.7, Chris Paul's a plus 5.8. 2009, Deron Williams a 3.7, Chris Paul's a plus 6. 2010, Deron Williams catches Chris Paul because Chris Paul's very injured. That team was very injured. Deron Williams gets a plus 4.1, Chris Paul's a plus 4. And like on off numbers, like Deron Williams never has this crazy on off signal, right? In 2008, the Utah Jazz are a plus point oh point 0.6 on off indicator with Deron Williams, right? Plus 0.9 in 2009. And then finally in 2010, get a plus 7.3. But Chris Paul during that stretch, a plus 9.1, plus 19.6 in 2009. That's Jokic like, right? Plus
Yeah.
5.7. So in 2010. So then I'm like, okay, wait a second. Like what am I? Is it? Because if you look at cleaning glass, a lot of it is defense, right? Deron Williams is giving away a lot on defense. I'd say some of the lack of on-off from Deron Williams is Sloan, right? Just being such a great coach, having such a healthy ecosystem, right? But I also wonder, and this is gonna sound crazy because we just talked about how great this offense was, how close the Jazz were to winning an NBA title right during these years, despite it not looking that way. Do you really think this Utah Jazz team was well constructed for Deron Williams' strengths and weaknesses?
Ooh. Um,
Because I have a number for you. I have a number for you really quick because there's one player
I
in
want to push that.
particular
Yeah, I
I
want to
feel
push
like
that back to you. I want to push that
I
back
have
to
one
you.
number for you before you say what you need to say. But it's funny because they got all these Stockton Malone comparisons at the time. It was the sexy thing to do, right? This is the new era of Jazz basketball, and it was like Deron Williams and Carlos Boozer, man, this crazy pick and pop game they have going. But it's just like these. I think Boozer, honestly, I'm kind of convinced, even though how like aesthetically pleasing of a basketball player he is with that crazy wind up jump shot, the huge biceps, the bald head. He just looks cool, right? He looks like a cool ass dude. But like, I'm convinced he's kind of like the Julius Randle of that era. I don't know how you feel about that. Or just like this physical freak who like just isn't like super efficient. Like doesn't have a great shot diet, right? He's not a good defensive player. Um, and so like they'd run this pick and roll, right? And he would get to that little short pop, the Joel Embiid, mid range. And it was just like it's not a pick and pop three, right? Like how you get with a core, and he's not rolling to the rim like Tyson Chandler. He's not a rim protecting guy. He's not a great interior defender. He's not like some switchy guy. Like what is, if you look at their PvP stats, right? Their Deron Williams is so the Jazz are in that 4 year stretch a +4 net rating when Deron Williams is on the court with Boozer. Okay, when Boozer's on the court without Deron Williams, I think they're about a +1.5. When Deron Williams is on the court without Boozer, they're a +8. You start to see that like that signal of a very like an all-time season type player, right? So that's just like something like what if he had a Tyson Chandler? What if he got healthy Andre Kirilenko? What if he just had a more balanced line? Because like that, okay, 2009, 2010, those Hornets teams were rough, right? They got injuries. They lose Tyson Chandler in 2010, but in 2008, like the line
That
of
was a good team.
balance on that team, you got Chris Paul, Mo Pete, perfect 3-and-D guy, Peja, perfect on-ball, off-ball hybrid scorer, David West. Who would you? Oh, this is a question I had for you. Who would you take in that time, David West or Carlos Boozer? Just a quick one worder.
I think David West. I think David West. Yeah.
Boom. Right? Okay, and
I
that's
think
Deron
David
Williams'
West.
pick and roll partner. Because I would take David West because of the two-way juice, right? It's not because he's
Yep.
better at the short pop than
The defense.
Carlos Boozer. And then you have Tyson Chandler, one of the most underrated players of that era, right? He's
Yeah.
the proto rim running, rim protecting big man. Like, we talk about Chris Paul being such a great lob passer and being a better fit with Dwight Howard. It's because we never saw Deron Williams with like a rim runner, right? How do we know like Deron Williams would have been great at throwing lob passes?
That's totally
like Chris
fair.
Paul. And
That's
so
a great
I was
point.
like, no, that's what I'm like. Okay, so because I'm trying to figure out because I watch these two, I see like the points per 100, assists per 100, some of the other advanced metrics like you and me have access to, and I'm like, these guys are right. They're neck and neck, like offensively. Like you're flipping a coin, and then you look at the plus minus, and you're like, why is it like Chris Paul's on this whole other level than Deron Williams? And that's what I'm trying to figure out.
So I think there are a lot of factors at play here. I think some of it could just come down to a lot of lineup choices. I think one thing in particular that you see with the Jazz that really tanks Deron Williams' numbers, and I think you see this a lot with modern day players. Like, for example, Luka's on-off never looked great because when he went to the bench, Kyrie or Brunson became the starting point guard. And it was like, well, now we're not losing much because these guys against a bench unit can still produce like all NBA level offensive players. With the Jazz and Deron Williams, they didn't really have that backup point guard. But what they did have was, okay, Deron Williams goes to the bench. Now we're going to start running our offense through Boozer, who can give you 18 to 20 points per game on a diet of tough shots. And then we're going to defensively slant our lineup. So you get these Boozer plus crazy defense minutes. So, like, what's really interesting is when you look at the on-off, like you said, overall, you get Chris Paul with this huge signal and Deron Williams with this, like, minuscule, like, +3 over the 4 years or whatever. But just on offense, Chris Paul's +10 on off and Deron Williams is +8 on off. So that's what's really interesting to me because it's like everything is just changing on defense where the Jazz go to these defensively slanted lineups that can't really score, but then they still win the minutes because they're getting a bunch of stops and then Boozer floor raises the offense enough to, or like you get these shooters like Okur or whoever to floor raise the offense enough alongside Boozer. So I do think if you just isolate the offense, there is still some of that like on-off juice with Deron Williams. But the other thing is, I think Chris Paul is on a short list, even this version of Chris Paul, on a very short list of players in NBA history who can drag an offensive unit to average high, like any offensive unit to an average. And maybe Deron Williams could have done that, but it was a different type of role. He didn't ever have to do that. So with Chris Paul during these years, like 09 and 10, 09, like you said, he gets like the +20 on off. That team ends up, I believe, with like a league average offense. They ended up with +0.4 relative offensive rating. And it's like without Chris Paul, they would have been maybe the worst offense in the league. And so the offensive impact numbers are automatically just going to be like, this guy is doing so much. But also to that point, I think you kind of talked about it. Chris Paul has a lot of statistical advantages in the regular season that just accumulate into a catch-all metric like offensive EPM and make him look significantly more valuable. Whereas I also would say Chris Paul is just the clearly better regular season offensive player. The discussion is who would you rather have in the playoffs? I think that's where Deron Williams' size, athleticism, off-ball game gets a lot of these more advantages. But specifically looking at just the regular season and what goes into offensive estimated plus minus, you get more points from Chris Paul. You get more efficiency from Chris Paul. You get more assists. You get less turnovers. You get twice as many steals. And it's like once all of these things add up, then you get a player who's like 2 or 3 points more valuable on the stat sheet, when maybe that isn't necessarily the case just because the box score component of all of these metrics carries so much weight.
Yeah. No, I love all you said. That was what I had in theory. The only thing that throws me off, and this is funny, we're in like minute 45 of this, and I'm about to bring up Gennaro Pargo. But I think Gennaro Pargo was like the best backup either one of those guys played with during that time. Like Gennaro Pargo was pretty cool. Like he was kind of like,
he's all right.
Like Anthony Simons, like kind of like, you know what I mean? Like just kind of scorer off the bench, really speedy. And in 2008, like Chris Paul still has a significantly better on-off signal, despite Deron Williams playing with Ronnie Price, who's more like you said, defensively slanted guard. But like I said, Pargo was the best backup I think either of them played with during that stretch. And so that was just something I was like, okay, like, who is your backup? And I'm like, I like Pargo more than I like Ronnie Price, but
yeah. So what other metrics did you look at for offensive value? Because I actually tried to gather pretty much everything I could.
I got
But
I got just basketball reference, thinking basketball and dunks and threes. I
gotcha.
mean, yeah. What did you got?
So when thinking basketball, they have the scaled adjusted plus minus. Did you
Mm-hmm.
separate? Did you look at the offense only for that, or did you just look at the total? Because the total number is like Chris Paul overwhelmingly better.
Mm,
On
yeah.
offense, you get Deron Williams at plus 2.4 per game and Chris Paul at plus 3.2 per game. So Chris Paul worth 0.8 more points, which I think in the regular season is totally fair. Again,
Mm-hmm.
that gap probably gets closer in the playoffs. You look at Darko's offensive daily plus minus. Deron Williams plus 2.8, Chris Paul plus 4.1. This is again per 100 though. So again,
Mm-hmm.
per game, you get like 0.8, 0.9. The most interesting one to me though is I looked at the 4-year RAPM for both guys. And offensively, this is again per 100 possessions. Deron Williams at plus 4.2, Chris Paul at plus 5. So that's maybe half a point, 0.6 points per game, which I actually like across these plus minus based metrics that are more heavily geared towards the lineup stuff. It's like Chris Paul being 0.5, 0.6, 0.8 points per game more valuable in the regular season to me kind of checks out. I think that's totally
Mm-hmm.
fair, especially when considering, like you said, the offensive load and the more responsibility he has to carry within those teams.
That's fair. That's fair.
And also, I
Okay.
mean, to be also like these metrics are we have to like have this caveat. They're all situational. Like this
Yeah,
doesn't tell you
that's
who
where I
would
was
be
going
more
back to. Like,
valuable
what
in
if
a
Deron Williams had
different
Tyson Chandler? What if Deron Williams
right.
had Tyson Chandler? You know what I mean?
Well,
That's
like
why I'm
because
like,
well, and what's so interesting is like going back to Luca on per like adjusted plus minus and RAPM stuff. Lakers Luca is the most valuable he's ever been.
hmm,
But like we all know that's not the case. Like we all know. So it's like take these metrics with a grain of salt. They're not meant to be okay, this guy, every metric says he's zero point 0.5 points more valuable. He has to be zero point 0.5 points more valuable. It's just like a baseline, a guideline almost.
hmm. Now, the one other thing I want to talk about here, because so before we answer this question about the offense and ultimately answer the question about who you're going to take, um, so we talk about the playoffs, right? Deron Williams, riser for sure, 1,000,000%. Put it in pen. Chris Paul, he looks like a faller in this small sample, right? Because of the Nuggets series. But if you look at like the rest of his career, at least in my like what I was looking at in PBV stats, like this guy looks like he maintains his offensive value, maintains his defense, improves. Like it's just the injury bug, right? Can't really make it through a full postseason, but he's always when he's healthy, he's playing well in the postseason. So I'm gonna guess it's just small sample size, and he wasn't a faller in his Hornets years, especially if you look at the 2008 season. So do you like really think Deron Williams has that much of a significant advantage as a playoff player offensively? Because if he doesn't, then I mean we have our answer, right? Because we both are in agreement that Chris Paul's the better regular season offensive player, but championships aren't really won in the regular season.
I have a take about Chris Paul's playoff offense that I think is
Okay.
really interesting. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people don't really address this with Chris Paul. I think on one side of the token, you get the Chris Paul detractors. They're like, he blew a 2-0 lead. He's getting injured. He's a playoff choker. But then you get the other side, and it's like, well, look at the box score. He's actually getting better in the playoffs. I think Chris Paul in the playoffs is very interesting because I think we've seen time and time again in the playoffs defenses are able to scheme for his playmaking in a
Mm-hmm.
way that you cannot scheme for any other all-time great playmaker. And I think it's because of the fact that he doesn't have those physical advantages to just impose himself on a game. Like when he takes over a game as a scorer, it's through shot making. It's not through you cannot stop me from getting wherever I want to go, like a Deron Williams, where it's like I'm gonna get to the rim over and over and over again. My question is, we never got to saw it because of the big sample. Chris Paul in the Hornets days with the added agility maybe does not run into that issue. Like I think with Clippers Chris Paul, you see a lot of these series where he'll go up to like 23 or 24 points per game, but then go down to like 8 assists from the 19 and 10 he gives you in the regular season. And I think that's defenses are switching more, they're honing more in on the
Staying
playmaking,
home.
and then he has to take over as a mid-range scorer. And like because he can do that, he's still so valuable. But my question is like, I think you would agree with me. Chris Paul is more valuable as a playmaker than he is as a scorer. So what you see with these Clippers teams is the playoff like net rating and stuff like that. Like the team performance just falls off a cliff in a lot of these series. Like they lose, and obviously there's injuries at play, but like they should not have lost the 2015 series to the Rockets after going up 3-1. And I think a lot of that is teams being able to scheme for Chris Paul's lack of physical advantages. It's kind of like nitpicking, but like you said, with two players of this caliber, we have to nitpick. And I do think Deron Williams having more physical advantages probably did make him, even if Chris Paul could still rise, I do think Deron Williams has a bigger signal of I just simply am a much better player in the playoffs. Like, every year, Deron Williams is just a much better player in the playoffs than the regular season.
And I mean, like we said, he only loses to the best. Like he loses to Kobe and Tim Duncan for 4 years, right? So
yeah,
and I like it. Honestly, it was his defenses. It was Utah's defenses that failed him in those series, and I mean, that has something to do with Deron Williams, right? If he was Jason Kidd as a defender, their defense would probably be a little bit better. But playing Mehmet Okur, Carlos Boozer together, not going to lead to the best defense, in my opinion. Real quickly, did you like my Julius Randle, Carlos Boozer comparison? I feel like that's pretty close. Am I wrong?
That made sense. I've never heard anyone do it, but like I've been thinking about that now. I'm like, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, I do think I really liked what I saw from Randle in these playoffs specifically, though.
Yeah, I mean, like the usual Randle.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, like mixed like 2021 playoff Randle. I could see some Boozer for sure.
But okay, so like let's say we concede, right, that Deron Williams is the better offensive player in a nutshell because of the playoff. Let's just, for the sake of argument, right, say that.
Okay. Because I was saying I would still prefer Chris Paul, but I do.
Oh, so you're gonna go with Chris Paul?
I'm gonna go with Chris Paul. Yeah, I do think I'd go with Chris Paul still. Like I said, I think Deron Williams is a little bit more dynamic, but I do still think Chris Paul is just so good at what he does, with the pick and roll game, that I just see more scenarios where it's like I can structure an offense around this guy. And compete for a championship. Not that you couldn't with Deron Williams. It's just like just personal preference. I think Chris Paul has an advantage there. So I would ultimately give the nod to Chris Paul on offense, but it's not some big drastic difference.
Okay, so for the sake of continuing this conversation, I'm going to say I would take Deron Williams. Right, I prefer the versatility. I think he's a better passer to me. I love his burst. Love the off ball ability, all that stuff. Playoff riser. If we say Deron Williams is a better offensive player, is it enough to make him for the defensive limitation?
No, I don't think it is. I think because Chris Paul starts at like a 0.6, 0.5, like half a point advantage on defense, in order for this to be a legitimate who's better overall discussion, I think Deron Williams would have to clear him on offense. I think you have to go into this with confidence and be like, Deron Williams is the better offensive player. I don't need to really discuss much further than that. And I don't come away from that. Even if you do prefer Deron Williams, I don't come away from it with any level of confidence.
Cool. Man, I just lost my train of thought. That was a really good statement. Okay, real quick, so people can, because you're using numbers, right? And people don't always understand numbers. Can you give me a current day example of 2 point guard defenders that are there's a 0.5 difference between them on defense? Do you have one off the top of your head?
Let me think. So yeah, I think if I were to go somewhat comparable to both players, I think with Deron Williams, we're talking about maybe the caliber of defender of I'd say slightly worse than Donovan Mitchell. Maybe a Jamal Murray. We'll call it a Jamal Murray type of defender, or a Devin Booker from this past year. I think slightly better than a Brunson or a Garland, somewhere in that type of range, versus a Fred VanVleet, maybe Van Vliet's a good conversation because it's another small guard like Chris Paul, or someone like that, maybe or slightly better than Desmond Bane, something like that. I do think it's the difference between, because a lot of people don't understand the plus minus numbers. When I say a half a point, I'm basically saying a slight minus defender versus a slight positive defender. Someone who's actually adding value to a team defense versus someone who's probably detracting a little bit of value from a team defense. Maybe if we go, I think I can get a better comparison if we're not just focusing on guards. DeMar DeRozan versus Kevin Durant, to me, would be a great depiction of a half a point on defense.
Okay, so just for the listeners at home, that's what we're talking about here. But yeah, I think I'd go with you at the end of the day. I think I lean just Chris Paul. Like you said, the two-way play, the advanced metrics. Maybe it's a little bit of anchoring my bias, right? Because we've seen over the years. But it's close. It's an incredible debate. I think these are two incredible players, two incredible peaks. Some of the best peaks we've seen in NBA history. One other thing I wanted to say real quick before we get out of here. I had this number pulled up, man. I don't know why I need to share it with you, but I feel like you're probably one of the only people on earth that would appreciate this.
There.
All right. According to PvP stats, great resource. Mo Williams in 216 games from 2007 to 2010. Mo Williams averaged 26 points per 100 possessions, shot 42.2% on 7 3-pointers a game, 57% true shooting, 8 assists per 100. Cavs had a plus 3.3 plus minus on the court. I don't know why I was pulling up like all-star guards from that time just to like get a feel for like the numbers, and I was like, hey man, Mo Williams, pull up shooting master.
Shout out Mo Williams, man. I have a lot of respect for Mo Williams. He was a hooper. I think to kind of put a pin
please
and end this discussion on my end with the Deron Williams and Chris Paul stuff. I think it is an interesting like year by year thing. I think over the 4-year stretch, I'm pretty comfortably taking Chris Paul because of the defense. I think Chris Paul specifically hit heights in 08 and 09 that Deron Williams just didn't on either side of the ball. But I will say, personally, going year by year, Deron Williams gets him in 2010. I do think 2010, Deron Williams gets him. Unfortunately, Steve Nash was the best point guard in the world in 2010, so it didn't matter that Deron Williams got him. But I do think like if we're doing the Deron Williams versus Chris Paul, and you want to say like there was a point in time where Deron Williams was better, I do think 2010 is that time. I think Deron Williams did get him in 2010.
I appreciate you saying that. I think that's a really good piece. And then that's the year. Think about it. That's the year Okor's not playing as much. I can't pronounce his name, but Kyle Fresnico or something.
Kyrilo Fasenko, I think it is.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, he's like playing more minutes at center. He actually has the best plus minus of any player on the team that year, and that just shows how much they needed just a rim protector, right? They have Wes Matthews that year, just a lot of wing defenders. They have Kyle Korver, one of the great latent value players in NBA history. But yeah, I appreciate that. Tyler, before I plug you real quickly, I forgot to do the ad read. Me and Tyler, we look at a lot of stats on Basketball Reference. If you want to look at something cooler than Basketball Reference, it's also the parent company of Basketball Reference, Stathead, where you can pull up crazy numbers like, I don't know, Mo Williams' top 20 game score performances of his career. You could use Stathead, right? And if you want to, because Stathead costs money, like most things in modern civilization. If you want to pay 20% less money for a 1-year subscription, use the code ISAHOOPS20. That's the name of this channel, 20. And you can get 20% off. Helps me make money, helps me start to monetize this so I can diversify my income and not just have to rely on writing, which could be overtaken by AI in the next couple of years. But yeah, just, use the discount code, man, please. But anyways, Tyler, where can we find you?
No, use Stathead to look up the fact that Kyle Korver shot 54% from 3 in 2010. Unreal.
That's amazing.
Unreal player. No, all my content can be found at Hoop Venue on all platforms. I'm working on a big video series previewing the 30 NBA teams, so I'm excited for that. So yeah, if you're looking for historic or current NBA content, Hoop Venue, all platforms.
How much? Okay, can you give away one thing for people that listen to this that stayed with us this whole time? How many minutes of all that series do you think you're going to talk about Grady Dick?
I actually already wrote the Raptors video out, and I think Grady Dick didn't get too much shine. I'm not going to lie,
really?
Man.
Dude, really? I think he's like such a huge part of their team this year.
I am big on Grady Dick. I did mention like he needs minutes. I will say on the Raptors side, a little bit of spoiler. That video is going to be very much focused on integrating Colin Murray Boyles because I think he's super interesting. Okay. But Grady Dick at the beginning of last season was a demon with the mid-range game. Like if that's the new Grady Dick, sign me up, man. I might have to do a separate Grady Dick video. But I will say in the Raptors video, wasn't one of my main points of focus personally.
Okay. I just think he makes their lineups make so much more sense with the spacing and size. But
absolutely, absolutely does.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, make sure you guys, like, subscribe. What else am I supposed to tell these people? Like, subscribe, comment. Tell me what historical topic you want me to cover next. I was thinking about maybe doing did Gary Payton actually lock up MJ in the 1996 NBA Finals? I already have my personal thoughts on that, but we could talk about it in video format. But anyway, thank you guys so much.